In the second week of September 1944, on a torn-up road west of the French port of Brest, an American gun crew did something the manuals warned against. They stopped firing from behind the ridge. They hooked a piece of heavy siege artillery to a prime mover, dragged it forward into the open where the German garrison could see it, unlimbered it a few hundred yards from a concrete fort, and laid the barrel dead level. The gun was an 8-inch field piece, a weapon built to throw a shell better than 20 miles from behind the lines. On this afternoon, the crew was going to fire it like a rifle, straight into a wall. By then, the fortress they were shooting at had held for more than a month. 40,000 German troops were dug into steel and reinforced concrete, and every field gun the Americans had rolled up so far had burst harmlessly against 6 feet of it. That is the fight this is about. A fortress the Germans were told to hold to the last man. An American army that could not get through the concrete with anything in its inventory. And the heavy guns that were finally brought forward to grind the place down one position at a time. This is how the 8-inch guns and the 240mm howitzers took Fortress Brest apart, bunker by bunker, and you are going to watch the method work. Fortress Brest comes first. The answer means nothing unless you understand what it. Brest sat on the tip of Brittany, a deep water port the Germans had spent 4 years turning into a fortress. The Kriegsmarine had built a submarine base there, roofed with something far heavier than any ordinary roof. It was a raft of reinforced concrete, many feet thick, poured in layers, strong enough that Allied heavy bombers had already tried it and left it standing. A 500-pound bomb could scorch the top of that slab, and the boats underneath would still sail. If the pens could take a direct hit from the air and shrug it off, no field gun on a gun line was going to trouble them either. Around the harbour ran a belt of older French forts, coastal batteries, pillboxes, gun pits and wire. Behind those stood the medieval city itself, ringed by a stone rampart that had been old when Napoleon was young. The Germans wired all of it together. Machine gun nests covered the approaches. Anti-tank ditches carved up the fields. Mines were seeded across every likely path of advance. The man holding it was General Hermann Ramcke, a paratroop officer who had fought in Crete and North Africa and had a reputation for stubbornness that matched his orders. His command was serious. At its core sat his own 2nd Parachute Division, some of the toughest infantry the German army had. Around it stood 2 regular infantry divisions. With them came a mass of naval personnel, submarine and torpedo boat crews handed rifles and told to fight as ground troops. In all, close to 40,000 men. Adolf Hitler had declared Brest a fortress, to be defended to the end, no surrender and no withdrawal, and Ramcke intended to obey. For the American command, this was a problem with a clock attached. General Troy Middleton's VIII Corps had come tearing across Brittany after the breakout in Normandy, and Brest was supposed to be the prize, a working port to feed the armies driving into France. The trouble was that Ramcke had no intention of handing over or working anything. From the first day, his engineers were already rigging the docks, the cranes and the seawalls with demolition charges. The Americans were racing to take a port, The Germans were busy wrecking, and to get to it, they first had to break through the hardest fixed defenses in France. They reached the outer ring on the 7th of August. Then the fight settled into something slow and grinding that the American infantry had not trained for. The war of movement was over. This was siege work. Here is where the German defense earned its reputation, and where the Americans nearly bled themselves out learning the lesson. The first instinct was to push infantry forward behind a curtain of standard field artillery, the way they had fought across Normandy. Did not work. The 105mm howitzers and the medium guns that had smashed German positions in the hedgerows would land on a Brest pillbox, throw up smoke and dirt, and leave the concrete standing. The garrison sat under yards of it and waited for the barrage to lift. The moment the American infantry rose to advance, the machine guns came back to life from firing slits that a field shell could not reach. Air power was no better against the concrete. The assault opened with bombing, and later the heavy bombers came back over the harbor, and the U-boat pens and the thickest bunkers took it and held. Bombs cratered the city and gutted the town, and the German gun crews stayed underground and waited it out. On the 25th of August, the Americans tried a set-piece push behind a heavy artillery barrage, 20 minutes of massed field guns walking across the German line before the infantry rose. The barrage lifted. The machine guns were still there. There was a second problem behind the first. The heavy shell fire that might have made a difference had to come across the beaches of Normandy in ships, and in the early weeks there was not enough of it. Ammunition at Brest was rationed. Gun crews were told how many rounds they could spend in a day, and a rationed siege gun cannot batter concrete on a schedule. Until the supply caught up, the Corps could not fire the way the fortress demanded. Attack after attack went in and came back thinned out. A rifle company would take a hedge, a farmhouse, a stretch of ditch, and pay for every yard, and the fort behind it was still there, still firing. Ramcke's paratroopers counterattacked hard and well. They knew the ground, they had prepared it for months, and they fought with the flat certainty of men who had been told there was no way home. The Americans learned to hate the individual strongpoints, the reinforced bunkers with interlocking fire, each one a small fortress that had to be taken on its own before the next could be touched, and as the casualties climbed into the thousands, the map barely moved. The lesson underneath all of it was simple and expensive. You could not shoot Fortress Brest flat from a distance with the guns an infantry division carried. The explosive was landing on the target, and the target did not care. Middleton needed something that hit harder, and he needed to change how it was used. The answer came up the roads from the rear, in pieces, on heavy transporters, moving at the speed of a man walking. It was the heavy siege artillery, the guns an army holds at corps and army level, and brings forward only when it has to break something that will not break any other way, and two of them mattered most at Brest. The first was the 8-inch gun. This was a long-barreled, heavy field gun with the longest reach of any American artillery piece in the war. It threw a shell of some 240 pounds at better than 2,800 feet a second out to a target 20 miles away. The whole rig weighed close to 35 tons and took a crew of more than a dozen men to serve. It was designed to sit far behind the line and drop steel onto things the enemy thought were safe. At Brest, the Americans found a second use for it. That flat, hard-driven shell, fired at short range, would do to a bunker face what no high-arcing field gun could. It could chip the concrete away, round after round, until the front of a strongpoint simply came apart. The second weapon threw an even heavier punch on a higher arc. The 240mm howitzer was the largest field piece the American Army fielded in Europe, a monster that lobbed a shell of 360 pounds out past 14 miles and came down almost vertically. Where the 8-inch gun cut into a wall, the 240mm came through the roof. A shell of that weight, falling steeply, could crack the top of a casemate that no lighter gun could touch, punch down through the overhead concrete, and gut the position from above. Assembling one was a day's labor with a crane. Once it was in place and registered, it was the closest thing the siege had to a key. Working between the two came the 155mm gun, the piece the crews called the Long Tom. It was lighter and quicker to lay than the 8-inch, and it threw a heavy, fast, flat shell that was made for exactly this work, driven straight into a bunker face or a stretch of fortified wall at close range until the concrete gave. The Americans brought these up alongside the heavier guns and used them the same way, over open sights against the strong points that would not fall to anything smaller. Middleton did not bring these guns forward one at a time. By the time the main attack was rolling, the Corps had massed on the order of 18 battalions of heavy artillery around Brest. Count in the divisional guns, the heavy mortars and the tank destroyers pressed into service as artillery, and better than 30 battalions were ringed on the fortress. The appetite of that much steel was enormous. The Corps had asked for 8,700 tons of ammunition to start, and 11,600 tons to cover the first 3 days of the assault. When the ships were unloading freely, it was taking in 1,000 to 1,500 tons a day and feeding all of it into the guns. That was the machine that reduced the fortress, a wall of heavy artillery fed by a river of shells. Neither gun was a wonder weapon. They were slow, heavy, thirsty for ammunition, and a nightmare to move. What they gave Middleton was the one thing his field guns could not: the power to defeat concrete on purpose rather than by luck, and a way to spend shells instead of infantry. The plan that grew around them was patient and cold. Stop trying to storm the fortress in a rush. Take it apart, position by position, and let the heavy guns do the hard work on the concrete before a single rifleman stepped into the open. The 8-inch guns and the 240mm howitzers took the strong points one at a time. They worked in close on the ground. Picture the crew of that 8-inch gun on its forward road in the second week of September. They have manhandled 35 tons of steel into a firing position where the target is a thing they can see, a grey hump of a bunker across a few hundred yards of cratered field. There is no arc to calculate, no forward observer on a radio. The gunner looks through the sights straight at the firing slit. The command is given. The gun slams back on its recoil, The shell crosses the gap almost flat, and a piece of the bunker face the size of a door blows away in dust and spalling. "Jord." They fire again. The German gun in that embrasure has stopped answering. Then the crew hitches up and moves to look at the next one. Where the 8-inch gun could not see its target, the 240mm howitzer did the same work from above. A bunker set back behind a rise, roofed in concrete, safe from any flat trajectory, was not safe from a shell of 360 pounds dropping almost straight down. The big howitzer would register on the position and then reach for it, and the shell would come down through the overhead cover, punch into the concrete, and open the top of the casemate like a tin. A garrison that had felt secure under yards of roof would find the roof was the way in. Between the flat gun cutting the front and the heavy howitzer breaking the top, a strongpoint had nowhere left that was hard. That was the rhythm of the reduction. The 8-inch guns and the 240mm howitzers went to work on the strongpoints in sequence, and behind the heavy shell fire came the infantry with the close-in tools, the flamethrower, the satchel charge, the pole charge shoved through a broken embrasure. A strongpoint would be battered until its guns fell silent, then rushed and cleared. Then the whole apparatus shifted to the next one down the line. The method was slow. It worked. Every position that came apart under the heavy guns was one the riflemen did not have to storm intact. The clearest picture of what this took is a fort called Montbarey on the western approach to the city. Montbarey was an old French work, its walls 30 feet high and 40 feet thick, ringed by a dry moat 15 feet deep, an anti-tank ditch and a field of mines, and held by some 250 determined men. Field artillery could not crack walls like that, and sending infantry straight at them would have been throwing men away. So the attack that went in on the 14th of September brought specialist armor the Americans had borrowed from the British, a squadron of Churchill Crocodiles, flame-throwing tanks of the 141st Royal Armoured Corps under Major Nigel Ryle. The Crocodile was a heavy tank towing an armoured trailer of thickened fuel, and it could throw a rope of fire more than 100 yards. The first day went badly. The Crocodiles felt their way toward the walls, looking for a way in, and found none, and the fort held. The path up to it was lined with German gun positions, and clearing them cost one Crocodile its entire load of fuel in a single afternoon of burning out pits one after another, and still the fort stood. So they changed the shape of the attack. While the flame tanks worked over the outer positions, American engineers went at the fort itself. They drove into a tunnel beneath the north wall and packed it with close to a ton of explosive. On the 16th of September, the last assault went in. Several Crocodiles moved up together and flamed everything but that north wall, holding the defenders down, and the charge under the wall was blown. More than 60 dazed survivors came up out of the ruins with their hands raised. Montbarey, which no field gun could have taken and no rushed infantry assault could have carried, was finished in 3 days by heavy fire, flame, and a tunnel full of explosive. The record kept the names of the men who worked those flame tanks up to the wall. One of them was a young British trooper named Alan Lynn, decorated for what he did in front of Montbarey. The citation was signed by the American Division Commander, Major General Charles Gerhardt, and it read that during this most vital and dangerous operation, Trooper Lin displayed outstanding aggressiveness and exemplary devotion to duty, which contributed materially in the reduction of this enemy fort. A British crewman, cited by an American general for cracking a French fortress full of German paratroopers. The same grinding method carried the Americans through the outer ring and up to the medieval city itself. On the 10th of September, the 8th Infantry Division came up against the old stone rampart around the inner town. The wall stood 25 to 35 feet high with a deep moat in front of it, a barrier built for a different century that the Germans had turned back into a fighting line. The answer was the same as it had been at every bunker. Heavy guns were dragged up close and fired point blank into the masonry until it broke, and the infantry went in through the gap and cleared the streets house by house. That street fighting was its own slow ordeal. Inside the walls, the Germans had turned houses into strongpoints, knocked passages through the party walls so a rifleman could move a whole block without stepping outside, and sighted machine guns to fire straight down the narrow lane. The Americans learned to stop using the streets at all. They fought through the buildings the way the defenders had, blowing holes in the walls between houses, tossing in a charge or a jet of flame, taking a room, then a floor, then the next house, working the block from the inside. It was measured in hours and single buildings rather than miles. Behind them, the medieval town came down in rubble, and every yard of it had to be paid for and held. The German garrison did not sit and take it. Ramcke's paratroopers counterattacked whenever the Americans overreached, coming back at a lost position hard and fast to take it again before the attackers could dig in. They fought like men with an order they meant to keep and no way out behind them, and they made the Americans buy each strongpoint twice, once to take it and once to hold it against the men who came to win it back. That is why the heavy guns mattered so much. A position that was cracked open and cleared before the infantry ever stepped into the street was a position the paratroopers could not counterattack their way back into. The men who did that close work paid the bill for the gun's success, and the record keeps their names. On the 29th of August, Sergeant John McVeigh of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, a paratrooper's son from Philadelphia, was leading his section when German infantry closed on his position in the dark. With his men pinned and machine gun jammed, McVeigh stood upright in full view of the enemy to direct fire onto them, then drew his trench knife and went at the attackers hand to hand to buy his section time. He was cut down doing it. The Medal of Honor he was given for that stand was posthumous. Multiply that fight by the length of the siege, and you have the cost. The heavy artillery was steadily lowering, every silenced bunker one less place a man like McVeigh had to charge. By the middle of September, the fortress was coming apart faster than Ramcke could shore it up. The inner city garrison gave up on the 18th. The next day, Ramcke himself surrendered. He had pulled back onto the Crozon Peninsula across the harbor and gone to ground in a bunker driven 75 feet into the rock. Even at the end, he tried to stall. He kept his last signal to Berlin clattering out on the wire while he demanded that the Americans prove their rank before he would yield. The officer who came to take his surrender, was Brigadier General Charles Canham of the 8th Division. When Ramcke, through his interpreter, asked to see Canham's credentials, Canham gestured back at the American soldiers crowding the bunker doorway behind him and said, "These are my credentials." The line stuck. It became the motto of the 8th Infantry Division, and it has stayed there ever since. Count the price on both sides. The 8th Corps took close to 10,000 casualties, reducing Brest, 9,831 of them, by the reckoning that was made afterward. On the German side, around 38,000 men went into the prisoner cages, the whole fortress garrison that Hitler had ordered to hold to the last. The fixed defenses that had stopped an American corps cold for 6 weeks had been ground out of existence, fort by fort, wall by wall. From the 7th of August to the 19th of September, the garrison held 43 days, the longest and hardest of the Brittany port sieges. Field guns and bombers had spent the first weeks proving they could not do it. What changed the ledger was mass and patience in heavy artillery, a wall of guns fed by a river of shells, laid over open sights and against the roofs until the concrete had no answer left. The men who study fortifications took the point. Concrete could stop a rush, and it could shrug off a barrage from a distance, and Brest showed it could not stand in front of a heavy gun brought up close and worked with time to spend. There is one bitter note in the victory, and honesty demands it be said plainly. The port itself was a ruin. Ramcke's engineers had done their demolition work thoroughly, and the siege had finished what the charges started, so that the deep water harbor the Americans had bled for was never opened as the supply base it was meant to be. The Allied High Command drew the obvious lesson. The remaining German-held ports in Brittany were left to sit behind their own walls, contained rather than stormed, because Brest had shown what taking one cost. There is a strange monument to all of it still standing. The submarine pens that no bomber could break are there today on the Brest waterfront, the same raft of concrete the Kriegsmarine poured. The heavy guns never had to face the pens themselves in the end, and the war moved on before anyone found a way to bring them down. The city around them was rebuilt from rubble. The pens simply could not be removed, and so they stayed, a grey reminder of the concrete. An American corps spent 6 weeks and 10,000 men learning to defeat everywhere else. But the thing the title promised was the reduction of the fortress, and the fortress was reduced. Look at what actually beat it. 40,000 men behind the hardest concrete in France, a paratroop general under orders to die in place, an old port ringed with forts that no field gun in the American army could crack. What broke it was heavy siege artillery, brought forward and used with patience. The 8-inch guns fired over open sights into the bunker slits. The 240mm howitzers punched down through the roofs. The whole belt was taken apart, one silenced position at a time, so the infantry could walk into ground that had been made survivable. The unbreakable fortress met the guns that were built to break exactly that, and it came apart bunker by bunker. On the 19th of September, a German general who had been told never to surrender handed his sword to an American who answered him with a doorway full of soldiers. That is the machine of it. Now tell me your piece of the story. Maybe you served an 8-inch gun or a 240mm howitzer. Maybe your father crewed one of these heavy pieces in Europe. Maybe you have stood inside one of the Brest forts and put your hand on concrete. These shells could not stop. Leave it in the comments. And tell me which fortress and which gun you want next. The West Wall and the 155s, Cherbourg and the battleships, or Fort Dryant and the flamethrowers. I read them, and the next one comes from you.